Putin declared a ceasefire for Easter and the world exhaled. But before that ceasefire even ended, the Kremlin said one thing: "We are not extending it." And during the entire ceasefire window both sides accused each other of hundreds of violations. That picture answers one question more clearly than any diplomatic statement ever could. Does Russia actually want peace, or is it simply buying time? The data answers that question. And the answer is going to make you uncomfortable. Since February 2022, Russian forces have suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties. That is the highest casualty figure any major power has recorded in any war since World War II. Ukraine has suffered between 500,000 and 600,000 casualties, with between 100,000 and 140,000 confirmed killed. In 4 years, two countries have lost nearly 1.7 million people on the battlefield combined. Those numbers are easy to say and very hard to absorb. In the entirety of World War I, Britain lost roughly 900,000 soldiers. Russia has already exceeded that figure in this single conflict. And what Russia has gained on the ground in exchange for that price is, by any honest military assessment, extremely limited. The Center for Strategic and International Studies puts it plainly. Russia is paying an extraordinary price for minimal gains and is in decline as a major power. But that decline on the battlefield is not translating into movement at the negotiating table. Putin claims that Ukrainian control of the Donetsk region has shrunk from roughly 35% 6 months ago to somewhere between 15 and 17% now. The Kremlin says it is advancing successfully. Ukrainian officials claim their forces have made counter gains in key areas. Both sides are telling their own version of a war that has ground into something neither side can win cleanly, but neither side is willing to stop. That is the core problem. The battlefield is stuck. The war is not. In late 2025, the Trump administration attempted to restart meaningful Ukraine-Russia negotiations. The 28-point peace proposal Washington put forward was rejected by Ukraine and its European allies on the grounds that it conceded too much to Russia without sufficient security guarantees for Kyiv. Ukraine and Europe then developed their own 20-point counterproposal that better reflected Ukrainian interests, particularly on the question of territorial integrity and post-war security architecture. In January 2026, Paris hosted a summit of 35 nations with 27 heads of state and government present in person. U.S. negotiators Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner sat alongside French President Macron, British Prime Minister Starmer, and Ukrainian President Zelensky. The coalition of the willing produced a formal declaration with concrete commitments. The UK and France pledged to establish military hubs on Ukrainian soil following any ceasefire. The US committed to leading a ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism. Ukraine's chief negotiator Rustem Umerov stated that 90% of the peace plan had already been agreed upon. That sounds like progress. But the question that changes everything is what exactly sits inside the remaining 10%. The unresolved issues in the Ukraine-Russia peace process are not technical footnotes. They are the fundamental disagreements that caused the war in the first place, and they have not moved. The territorial question is the most obvious. Ukraine's position is that the current front lines should be frozen as the basis for any ceasefire. Russia's position is that it holds sovereign claim over the entirety of 4 Ukrainian regions it has declared annexed, including areas it does not fully control on the ground. These two positions are not close to each other. They are not even in the same negotiating universe. Ukraine freezing the line means Russia keeps land it seized by force. Russia demanding full recognition of its annexed regions means Ukraine surrenders territory where Ukrainian citizens still live. Neither government can politically survive accepting the other's opening position. The security guarantee question is equally explosive. Ukraine insists on legally binding and militarily enforceable guarantees from Western nations before it will sign any agreement. The logic is straightforward. Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 and gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Russia invaded anyway. Kyiv will not repeat that mistake without guarantees that carry real teeth. Russia's response to the Western security guarantee framework is equally firm. Putin has stated categorically that the deployment of any NATO country troops to Ukrainian soil is unacceptable and would constitute a direct provocation. The UK and France have committed to exactly that deployment. These two positions cannot coexist in the same agreement. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant adds another layer of complexity. Russia controls Europe's largest nuclear facility which sits on Ukrainian soil. Ukraine cannot accept a permanent peace that leaves that plant under Russian control. Russia has no intention of surrendering it. And the safety risks associated with a nuclear facility operating in an active war zone represent a threat that extends far beyond either country's borders. There is a factor in the Ukraine peace process that rarely gets the direct analysis it deserves. The outbreak of the US-Israel war against Iran in February 2026 fundamentally redirected American diplomatic and military energy away from Eastern Europe. The Iran war consumed the attention of the Trump administration's senior foreign policy team. Negotiations in Islamabad, the ceasefire management, the Hormuz situation and the pressure from global energy markets all created an immediate crisis environment that pushed Ukraine to the second tier of American priorities. Zelensky recognized this shift and said it directly. This spring and summer will be quite difficult politically and diplomatically. There will be pressure on Ukraine. There will also be pressure on the battlefield. That pressure is real and measurable. The coalition of the Willings Paris commitments require each participating country to ratify binding security agreements through their own domestic legal processes. That takes time. Meanwhile, Russia is still firing. Ukrainian forces are under sustained pressure along multiple frontline sectors. Every week that passes without a ceasefire is another week of casualties on both sides and another week of infrastructure damage that will take years and hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild. The Kremlin read Washington's distraction correctly. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirmed that the Easter ceasefire announcement was not coordinated with the United States and does not signal a resumption of negotiations. Putin's special envoy Kirill Dmitriev traveled to Washington for meetings with Trump administration officials, but Peskov was careful to clarify that Dmitriev is not negotiating a settlement in Ukraine and this is not a resumption of negotiations. That clarification was deliberate. Russia wants the world to see it engaging diplomatically without actually committing to anything. Pope Leo XIV's Easter message to the world was not a general appeal for kindness. It was a precisely aimed warning directed at specific actors and specific decisions, and the language he chose made that unmistakable. Standing before 50,000 people in St. Peter's Square on April 5, 2026, Leo said that God rejects the prayers of those who wage war and that those with hands full of blood are not heard. He said, "Let those who have weapons lay them down and let those who have the power to unleash wars choose peace through dialogue, not through force." He described a world growing indifferent to the deaths of thousands of people and called that indifference unacceptable. Earlier in January, during his address to the diplomatic corps, he said something that cut even deeper. The principle established after World War II by which nations pledged not to use force to violate the borders of others has been completely undermined, he said. And then he added the phrase that traveled around the world. War is back in vogue. That phrase is not theology. It is a geopolitical diagnosis. And it applies directly to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which represents the largest violation of European territorial sovereignty since 1945. Leo described Russia's war in Ukraine as imperialist in nature, aimed at seizing territory for the sake of power. That characterization, coming from the head of the Catholic Church with 1.4 billion followers and diplomatic relations with more than 180 countries, is not a marginal opinion. It is a statement with real weight in international discourse. On Good Friday, Leo called both Israeli President Herzog and Ukrainian President Zelensky personally. He reiterated the urgency of humanitarian assistance and the need to work toward a cessation of hostilities. The Vatican under Leo's direction has also been actively working through Cardinal Matteo Zuppi to facilitate prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine, with some confirmed results. Leo offered the Vatican as a neutral venue for direct Russia-Ukraine negotiations. Ukraine welcomed the offer. Russia rejected it. That rejection tells you something important about where Moscow's diplomatic posture actually sits. The 32-hour Orthodox Easter ceasefire that Russia announced on April 10, 2026 is worth examining closely because it illustrates exactly why sustainable peace in this conflict remains so elusive. Putin announced the ceasefire unilaterally. Zelensky confirmed Ukraine would honor it. For a brief window there was a pause. Then the violations started. Russia's defense ministry claimed Ukraine committed 1.971 ceasefire violations including 258 artillery or tank firings, 1.329 FPV drone strikes and 375 additional munitions deployments. Ukraine accused Russia of violating the truce on its side. The Kremlin announced it would not extend the ceasefire. Both sides declared the other had broken the agreement. This pattern is not new. A similar Easter ceasefire in the previous year produced identical results. Both sides accused each other of violations immediately. Both sides used the ceasefire period to consolidate positions rather than genuinely stand down. The ceasefire ended without any momentum toward longer-term negotiations. What the Easter ceasefire demonstrates is the difference between a tactical pause and a genuine de-escalation process. Russia can announce ceasefires. Ukraine can honor them. But without a structured negotiating framework with monitoring mechanisms and consequences for violations, a ceasefire is simply a brief interruption in a war that neither side has decided to end. The broader peace talks have stalled further since Washington's attention shifted to the Middle East. As Al Jazeera reported, progress toward a Ukraine peace deal had been slow even before the Iran war, and the Iran crisis deepened that stagnation further. Understanding Russia's actual negotiating objectives is essential to understanding why this war has lasted more than 4 years and why it may last considerably longer. Russia's stated demands have remained remarkably consistent since before the invasion began. Recognition of Russian sovereignty over Crimea and the 4 annexed Ukrainian regions. Ukraine's formal commitment not to join NATO. Severe limits on the size and armament of Ukraine's military. The withdrawal of Western weapons systems from Ukrainian territory. And crucially, an end to Western military and financial support for Kyiv. None of these demands have been accepted. None of them are likely to be accepted by any Ukrainian government that wants to survive politically. And Russia has shown no meaningful flexibility on any of them. Putin's calculus appears to be based on the belief that time favors Russia. That Western support for Ukraine will eventually erode. That European publics will grow tired of the economic costs associated with the war. That America's attention will shift to other crises. That Ukraine's manpower pool will eventually run dry while Russia's larger population gives it a long-term demographic advantage on the battlefield. Some of those calculations have partial validity. Western public support for Ukraine has shown signs of fatigue in certain countries. The U.S. political environment has shifted toward a more transactional view of the relationship with Kyiv. The shift of American attention to Iran is exactly the kind of distraction Russia was waiting for. But other parts of Putin's calculation have proven wrong. The assumption that Europe would fracture quickly and withdraw support has not materialized. The coalition of the willing has held together despite significant internal disagreements. European defense spending has increased dramatically since 2022. And Russia's own military and economic losses have been far higher than its pre-war planning appears to have anticipated. Ukraine's position going into 2026 is fundamentally different from where it was in 2022. The initial shock of repelling Russia's attempt to take Kyiv demonstrated Ukrainian military capability. The subsequent years of attritional warfare have demonstrated Ukrainian resilience. But they have also revealed the deep structural challenges Ukraine faces in sustaining a long war against a larger adversary. Ukraine's proposal to freeze the conflict along current front lines reflects a pragmatic recognition that full territorial restoration, including Crimea and all 4 annexed regions, is not achievable in the near term through military means alone. But accepting a freeze means accepting Russian control over significant Ukrainian territory, including populations that did not choose Russian governance. The security guarantee question is existential for Ukraine. Without binding guarantees that carry real military enforcement mechanisms, any ceasefire simply becomes a pause that allows Russia to rearm, reconstitute, and attack again under more favorable conditions. Ukraine watched what happened to the countries that trusted verbal assurances in the past. The Budapest Memorandum is not an abstraction for Kyiv. It is a cautionary tale written in the blood of its own people. The Paris summit commitments represent the most concrete security guarantee framework Ukraine has received to date. But they have not yet been ratified. They have not yet been tested. And Russia has already said it will not accept them. The analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies who have tracked this conflict most consistently offer a sober assessment. Russia is in decline as a major power. Its military has been devastated. Its economy is under severe strain from sanctions. Its international isolation has deepened. But a declining power that still controls significant territory and still has the will to fight is not the same as a power that is ready to negotiate. The challenge facing any diplomat trying to end this war is what negotiators call the commitment problem. Both sides fear that any agreement they sign will be violated by the other side once military pressure is reduced. Ukraine fears that Russia will use a ceasefire to regroup. Russia fears that any genuine peace deal will allow NATO to entrench itself permanently on its border. These fears are not irrational given the history of this conflict. They are also mutually reinforcing in a way that makes breaking the cycle extraordinarily difficult. Leo's diplomatic offer of the Vatican as a neutral ground was one attempt to address the commitment problem by providing a credible neutral mediator. Russia's rejection of that offer suggests Moscow does not currently see any value in a negotiating environment where both sides are treated as equally legitimate parties operating under the same international norms. Zelensky's warning about the spring and summer being the most difficult period politically and diplomatically was not rhetorical. It was based on a concrete reading of the situation that several interconnected factors confirm. The Iran war ceasefire and the Islamabad negotiations will dominate Washington's attention for the duration of the 2-week window and likely well beyond it. If those negotiations succeed, they will create a template for managing Middle Eastern security that will require sustained American engagement. If they fail, the risk of renewed conflict in Iran will pull even more American resources and attention away from Eastern Europe. European defense budgets are increasing, but the weapons and equipment those budgets will fund are not yet delivered. The ramp-up in European defense industrial capacity takes years, not months. Ukraine needs ammunition and weapons now, not in 2028 when new European production lines reach full capacity. Russia's summer offensive pressure along the Donetsk front appears likely to intensify based on recent battlefield reporting. Putin's claim that Ukrainian control of the Donetsk region has dropped from 35% to between 15% and 17% suggests Moscow believes it can achieve further gains before any peace framework forces it to stop. And the diplomatic clock is running against Ukraine in ways that are difficult to reverse. Every month that passes without a ceasefire is another month of casualties, infrastructure destruction, and economic damage. Ukraine's reconstruction costs are already estimated in the hundreds of billions of dollars. The longer the war continues, the larger that number grows and the harder post-war recovery becomes. Pope Leo's January 2026 address to the diplomatic corps contained a sentence that deserves far more attention than it received. He said peace is a difficult yet realistic good. That combination of words matters. Difficult because the obstacles are real and documented and enormous. Realistic because history shows that wars that appeared permanent eventually end and that the conditions for ending them can emerge faster than anyone predicted. The Dayton Accords ended the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina after years of conflict that seemed intractable. The Good Friday Agreement ended decades of political violence in Northern Ireland at a moment when progress seemed impossible. The Cold War ended without a single shot being fired between the two primary adversaries despite decades of mutual preparation for catastrophic conflict. Each of those outcomes required specific conditions to align. A moment when the costs of continuing became undeniable to both sides. A credible mediator that both parties could trust. A framework that gave each side something it could present domestically as a win. And political leaders willing to absorb the domestic risks of compromise. None of those conditions currently align for Russia and Ukraine. But the fact that they do not align today does not mean they cannot align tomorrow. The Easter ceasefire, however brief and however violated, was still a ceasefire. The Paris summit, however incomplete, produced binding commitments that did not exist before. The fact that 90% of a peace framework has reportedly been agreed upon means that a complete framework is closer to existing than it has ever been. The 10% that remains is the hardest 10%. It is the territory question and the security guarantee question and the nuclear plant question and the fundamental question of whether Russia is negotiating in good faith or simply managing its international image while continuing to pursue military objectives. Leo's warning to the world is that indifference to these questions is not neutral. Becoming accustomed to violence and resigning ourselves to it is itself a choice with consequences. The war in Ukraine has been running long enough that for many people in countries not directly affected it has faded into background noise. That normalization is exactly what Leo was warning against. The negotiating table exists. The framework is partially built. The guarantees are partially committed. What is missing is the political will on Russia's side to engage with a process that treats Ukrainian sovereignty as non-negotiable. And what Leo was saying from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to 50,000 people and through them to the world is that the absence of that will has a cost, and that cost is being paid every single day by people who had no part in starting this war.